There could be no delay between mobilization and war, because if there were delay, then Russia would catch up and the Germans would get the two-front war after all. So that the moment that the Germans decided on mobilization, they decided for war. Or rather, it wasn't they decided for war, the thing followed of itself. The railway timetables, which in other countries brought chaps to their mobilizing centers, to their barracks and so on, in the Schlieffen Plan continued. They did not bring the troops to their barracks. They took them into Germany and northern France. The German mobilization plan actually laid down the first 40 days of the German invasion of France, and none of it could be altered, because if it did, all the timetables would go wrong. Thus the decision which the German General Staff made and which Bettmann endorsed on the 29th of July was a decision for a general European war.
This was the shelter for members of the United States Congress in the event of nuclear war. Down here, the politicians would represent the dead and the dying in the world overhead. For a handful of human beings, there was all they needed to wait out the nuclear winter. But nerves might snap, then order would be kept by force. The lost world above the shelter would become only a memory, a myth. The living would come to envy the dead.
Hello, I'm Forrest Sawyer. Welcome to our series, Liberty. We live in a time of fast-breaking news, which seems very far from the 18th century world, the subject of this series. Yet if you pick up a newspaper on any given day, you'll see items very familiar to the people who launched this country. Issues like taxes, freedom of speech, and the big theme that runs through this entire series, power. The power that government has over our lives. This series covers a span of 25 extraordinary years, a period when Americans transformed themselves from subjects of a king to citizens of a separate nation. And on the way, they devised a totally new system of government. Nothing's more surprising than the beginnings of the conflict. The founding fathers, like George Washington, were wealthy patricians. The last thing they wanted was a revolution. Yet the rich and powerful came to lead this uprising, one which would ultimately turn their privileged society upside down. As in all history, at the time, nobody knew where they were going, and they certainly didn't know how everything would turn out. But without intending it, they came up with the most revolutionary idea of the modern world, the idea that without kings and noblemen, ordinary people could govern themselves.
Back in Britain, a powerful anti-war movement was mobilizing. It was led by the Liberal Party's rising star, David Lloyd George, the first British politician to be the subject of a biopic. In December 1901, he was invited to address an anti-war meeting in Birmingham's Town Hall. This was the heart of Joe Chamberlain's political power, and Lloyd George had the Liberal turncoat in his sights.
This was too good an opportunity to miss, but the police told Lloyd George on no account to go to Birmingham. His appearance here would cause a riot. There were people in Birmingham who wanted to kill him. Joe Chamberlain was rubbing his hands with glee. If Lloyd George wants his life, he'd better stay away, he said. And then he twisted the political knife. If he doesn't come, I'll see that everyone knows he's afraid. If he does, he deserves all he gets. But Lloyd George didn't flinch. On December the 18th, 1901, he boldly stepped onto the stage of the Birmingham Town Hall. But before he could open his mouth, an angry pro-war mob, 30,000 strong, smashed all the town hall windows, broke down the door and stormed in. 2 men were killed in the crush, many more were injured. Lloyd George only managed to escape the mob by disguising himself as a policeman, helmet and all, and sneaking out of a side entrance. Back down in London, a vengeful Joe Chamberlain was lurking in his club, waiting for news. When he heard that Lloyd George had escaped, he was bitterly disappointed.
The Victorian home was a place of sanctuary from the outside world, especially in the cities where dirt and disease hung in the air and danger stalked the streets. And thanks to advances in science, a whole host of products and services were promising to make life at home cheaper, easier and more convenient. But they were also making life much more dangerous. For under the guise of family-friendly products, mass consumption was bringing killers into the very heart of the Victorian home. With the aid of modern science, I'll seek out the deadly assassins that hid on every floor.
Leaning too close to the fire and poof, they burst into flames.
I'll be revealing what the Victorians couldn't see inside their homes.
5 grams is sufficient to potentially kill a small child.
And showing the terrible injuries that were inflicted in the name of progress.
That could completely remove the skin from the hand and the arm.
Welcome back to the perilous world of the real Victorian home.
It's said that science will dehumanize people and turn them into numbers. That's false, tragically false. Look for yourself. This is the concentration camp and crematorium at Auschwitz. This is where people were turned into numbers. Into this pond were flushed the ashes of some 4 million people. And that was not done by gas. It was done by arrogance, it was done by dogma, it was done by ignorance. When people believe that they have absolute knowledge with no test in reality, this is how they behave. This is what men do when they aspire to the knowledge of gods. Science is a very human form of knowledge. We are always at the brink of the known. We always feel forward for what is to be hoped. Every judgment in science stands on the edge of error and is personal. Science is a tribute to what we can know, although we are fallible. In the end, the words were said by Oliver Cromwell. I beseech you in the bowels of Christ, think it possible you may be mistaken. I owe it as a scientist to my friend Leo Szilard. I owe it as a human being to the many members of my family who died here, to stand here as a survivor and a witness. We have to cure ourselves of the itch for absolute knowledge and power. We have to close the distance between the push-button order and the human act. We have to touch people.